Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome back to the Bill Walton Show. I'm in overtime with Frank Gaffney and Kevin Freeman, and we're talking about all things China. One of the things that we want to dig into with China is just what's happening on the space warfare front, and that they view that quite strategically, and so should we.
Absolutely. It's not just space warfare, Bill. As you talked about in the show, there's a comprehensiveness to the Chinese approach to most things. They see as an integral approach building commercial capabilities as well as national security capabilities in space, on the moon, in what they call the Earth-Moon system, and critical points in space that will enable them to actually control access to space and use of it by others.
I'm with you.
These are the sorts of things.
I'm sort of thinking of warfare. We had Steph Halfer on the show talking about China. He talks about the three warfares, how the economic and the military and the cultural all interrelate. I guess when I'm using in that broader sense of the word.
Yeah.
So
in the sense of unrestricted warfare, I guess you could say it's
yeah,
the People's War, which is the term they're using now.
That's the word they're using now.
Well, they're using the People's War, which it's the People's Liberation Army, it's the People's Republic of China, and now they're calling it the People's War. I mean, we are at war based on their rhetoric. We're at war right now. And space is a big part of that because it controls energy. I mean, Frank is the ideal person to talk to about this because if it weren't for Frank Gaffney, you know, this modern GPS system that we use all the time that makes it possible for me to look on my iPhone and see where I'm going and does so much of our economy is driven off that. That is a space warfare instrument, and if it weren't for Frank, it might not exist today.
You did that with a defense with Reagan?
No, actually, when I was a young staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee, we were hearing testimony from the then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, by the name of General Lew Allen, that they didn't need this newfangled navigation system, which the Air Force was being told to build. He said they've been navigating perfectly well without it for years. They basically didn't want to have the Air Force budget having to carry this national program that was going to involve a considerable expense.
Yeah.
And it came down, Bill, to the last item to be decided between the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees in a conference committee in 1981. And honestly, you could have flipped a coin. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you any better which way it would come out. Fortunately, the Senate position prevailed, and this GPS system went into production, and it's become what it's become. But
and you worked for a senator that pushed it over the
I worked at the
line?
time for John Tower, who
That's
was chairman of the
yeah.
Senate Armed Services Committee.
Yeah.
But the reason I say this is we're in a very similar moment right now because the Air Force has taken, I believe, a very similarly parochial position with respect to space warfare. It is being subordinated to, you know, the white scarf, you know, fighter pilot kind of priorities of the past. An exception to this is an extraordinary man by the name of Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, who until very recently was the commander of all of the Air Force's Air Education and Training Command. And he has been a visionary on space, and he has perceived and taught, frankly, me and probably Kevin and many others about what China's prospective control of space for power, for military activities, for, you know, domination of the moon, for exploitation of resources, for projection of power terrestrially would mean for this country, both economically and in terms of national security. And for his troubles, the Air Force has forced him into retirement. So we're trying to help President Trump recognize that I believe this is the general officer he's been looking for now for 2.5 years as President of the United States. He's a visionary leader who understands the threat we're facing and has the kind of practical approaches to what we can do to protect ourselves in the face of it that is desperately needed to command the new Space Force that the president has called for.
Where
rightly
does
so.
that stand? He gave the speech, what, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, rolled it out, and what I'm hearing is he's getting nothing but pushback from the Pentagon.
From the Air Force particularly. And this is a case in point. This
And so
particular general officer
the way to kill
agrees
it in the
with him.
cradle is to take the most effective advocate and
Right.
get rid of him,
Right. And then put somebody else, an Air Force guy in there who's going
who
to
won't do anything.
go along with the plan of doing nothing.
Yeah, no, this is the same mentality. And you've used the comparison of General Billy Mitchell. It's the same mentality that happened where the Navy said these airplane things aren't really the instruments of war. They're not really a big deal, and you could never, and
Now, he invented the aircraft carrier or concept.
General
he
Mitchell
pushed-
actually was an advocate. He was an Army Air Corps advocate that ships could be sunk by airplanes, number one. And number two, he traveled into Japan and he came back and said the Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor probably on a Sunday morning. And he was court-martialed and demoted and treated really poorly. He is the father of the modern Air Force, if anything. And every president since has come back and said, well, General Mitchell was right. General Quast is right.
Right.
This is absolutely.
So what are the Chinese doing on this front? Specifically, are they launching?
Let me give you a couple of examples.
What
What
technologies?
the Chinese
what's the,
are doing is focusing on space control. And they
Okay.
have a whole host of technologies, some of which are ground-based,
Yeah.
some of which are space-based, that involve everything from direct physical attack capabilities to lasers to robotic systems in space that can reach out and break a satellite that it happens to sidle up to. I mean, in other words, techniques that would enable them, perhaps without being visibly identified as having done it, to neutralize assets that, as Kevin was saying, we have to have, not just for our national security, but just for commerce. I mean, you take out our GPS system,
Yeah.
and as I'm sure you know, Bill,
Sure.
banking, among other things,
Yeah.
comes to a grinding halt. If
Kevin-
there's even
Kevin
a delay
understands that
of a
as
couple
well
of
as-
seconds in the
Yeah.
timing, it's a chaotic
But
situation.
they're also building solar capabilities to capture solar rays and then beam them back to the Earth, and they could
As power.
potentially dominate the
So,
energy.
So how
race.
much of that technology is our technology, and how much of it's their proprietary technology, or how much is it a?
Well, it's a mix. It's global technology, but a lot of it is our technology. We're the innovators
Yeah.
in so many of these areas.
But increasingly, they're getting good at it too. And more to the point, which goes back to something you talked about earlier, they have policies to actually translate these things into deployed capabilities. A lot of our stuff might be conceived of and even perhaps developed to a level, and then usually it gets killed because there isn't the money for it or there isn't the priority ascribed to it. In other words, they're eating our lunch by oftentimes taking it from us. In other cases, though, thanks to the millions of Chinese students that
Yeah.
we've trained in our universities, not in English literature, by the way, but in the hard sciences.
Yeah, STEM.
Hard
Yeah,
science,
they're
right?
writing more papers.
Yeah.
They have more STEM graduates. They're really genuinely advancing scientifically. They have some problems because they're not. They're very creative people, but their system's not very creative, and so they have to steal and beg and borrow at times. But they're gaining a dominant position, and they have the capability to do this because this is a nation that can impose a one-child policy. If they can tell a family how many babies they can have, they can mandate whatever they need to accomplish the objective.
So who in town in D.C. is pushing Space Force besides President Trump? Because it just occurs to me as we talk here that he has so many never-Trumpers in town that it seems like almost axiomatic that if he pushes it, there are going to be people saying, we don't want it.
That's true. And that's been particularly evident in the House under Democratic control.
Yeah.
The House Armed Services Committee has taken a very dim view of this idea. I think the Senate Armed Services Committee has been more supportive. There's a lot of confusion about it, frankly, because some people think, well, we'll just let the Air Force do it and it'll be sufficient unto the day. I don't agree with that. I think you do need a separate military service, and I think General Quast is exactly the right guy to implement this, especially because it's so important
It's a new
that you
domain.
get this right at the beginning.
So-
you don't want to
Just
waste
like we
time
have a
and money.
cyber domain, we need a space domain.
So what line of action should we use for Stephen Quast to help him?
This is a critical period.
Yeah.
Because the president has the next month to extend his service to our country in uniform. Otherwise, at the beginning of September, he's retired.
Okay, then we're talking in August 2019.
This is August 2019. I think the American people, their elected representatives, he's got a lot of support on Capitol Hill. Getting in touch with the White House, your representatives, the Defense Department, this is an all hands on deck kind of problem at the moment, because if we don't get this right, chances are we're going to lose this space race, and we can't afford to do that.
That's why the Pearl Harbor analogy is so good, because you would talk to Americans in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and they'd say, Pearl Harbor, that's just Hawaii. It doesn't impact me. And General Mitchell understood how important Pearl Harbor was. Space, well, of course, nobody's going to mess with my satellite or GPS. Nobody thinks in those terms. The average American doesn't realize how important this domain actually is. But if Pearl Harbor was compromised and overrun, the West Coast was subject to Japanese invasion, and few people recognize that. Right now, if the Chinese dominate space, our economy's gone. It's that existential. We cannot operate our modern economy without our space assets.
Explain the risk to our financial assets that you're talking about. It's not just the weapons, but describe how our money is dependent on space.
Everything's transmitted through space. It all goes through satellites.
Yeah.
The GPS is an example, but everything is transmitted at one level or another. Our whole telecommunications infrastructure is dependent on satellites. Right. And by the way, if you own the domain of space, you can also set off a small nuclear explosion and wipe out the entire electric grid. So the domain of space is absolutely existential to the United States of America.
So time frame for all this, I mean, we're going to put Stephen Quast on our to-do list, but not for the show right now, but we've got things to do afterwards. The other side of this, you take somebody like Gordon Chang, who's been on your show, and he talks about China. He doesn't see them as inevitable. I mean, he looks at their weaknesses, and he looks at their incredible abusive persecution culture, persecuting Christians, destroying churches, things like that, repressing people. He didn't think the economy is growing at 8%. He thinks
not.
it's growing at 1 or 2%.
That's probably
and
true.
their debt is growing, I think, as you pointed out, 5.5 times faster than their nominal GDP. So if we think we've got a debt problem, they really have a debt problem, and they're losing American reserves, currency reserves. I mean, how much pressure is China feeling right now? And I guess the other question is, my sense is in the trade negotiations they were having, they're not exactly insouciant. They really care about this outcome.
Not a benign implosion expected. You beware the wounded dragon. They're clearly a wounded dragon, and they will lash out. And that's my concern. That's where you've got these senior officers in the People's Liberation Army talking about getting America's attention by sinking aircraft carriers. Mm-hmm. We're talking about killing tens of thousands of American military personnel in order for China to make their point.
This is discussion among the Chinese military.
They've actually
publicly
made public statements to that effect. And interestingly enough, our friend Gordon Chang points out that that's not official Chinese policy. But on the other hand, they've not been reprimanded for making those statements.
Yeah,
they've not been broken in rank or anything.
Right.
But here's the key point as far as I'm concerned, as we're talking about, what do we do about all this? Gordon is certainly right, and Kevin too, that there are vulnerabilities to be exploited with the Chinese. And I think we should be doing a lot more of that. We should be going very, very frontally at the Chinese Communist Party, which is at the heart of the threat that we're facing now. But here's another piece of it that I think we have to factor into these considerations of, do we have a choice? Kevin has said we're at war with China, and I believe that's the case. Not because we want to be, or we even think of ourselves
We haven't
as being,
declared it. They
have. But here's the kicker. You mentioned the one-child policy. As a result of that policy being in place now for decades, they've modified it somewhat lately, but for decades, there are, by some estimates, 40 million men in China, military-age men, for whom there are no women. Now, that is a formula for a problem domestically, obviously. It's also something that lends itself to turning those people into cannon fodder to go find women or resources or whatever else the Chinese want elsewhere. So this thing has the potential, Bill, to move from an unrestricted warfare arena predominantly in the economic space into one that is highly kinetic, possibly in the heavens, possibly here on Earth. We have to be bending every effort, it seems to me, and I give Donald Trump great credit for doing a lot of this, to understand the full complexion of this threat and to be developing the capabilities that we need: economic, military, strategic, intelligence, political information that will enable us to compete at a minimum and ideally certainly deter.
And you don't, and neither one of you believe we have any choice but to engage. There's some people in town that say, well, we're being too tough on them. If we just let up, we'll coexist peacefully, and they'll be part of our economic arrangements, and we're going to be fine.
Engage is the wrong word.
This is existential
what we're
for
talking about.
China. Keep in mind, all right, President Xi is looking at a country that he thinks should be dominant in charge of the world. But he is also looking at a population problem. Demographically, they're losing population. How do you grow your economy? The only way you keep your head in China is you grow your economy fairly rapidly. Yeah. So they've been throwing debt at the problem. How do you grow your economy if you take the demographic? Because GDP growth is innovation, productivity, and population. If you don't have innovation, productivity, and population, and they're not, if we restrict on their access to our intellectual property, that's going to hurt their innovation and capabilities, and their productivity is having problems because it's a bad system. I mean, I think we agree that the communist system is a bad system. A statist controlling system doesn't work as well as a free system, and their population is dwindling. This is their time. They're going to have to lash out, and we have to be prepared for it.
Amen. One of the things I looked at preparation for our show is this book, Interviews with Kuan Yew, who was premier president of Singapore for, 5 decades, and turned them from like $500 per capita GDP to something like 50,000.
Phenomenal.
One of the extraordinary things he did when he got into the job was he made English Singapore's first language, because he felt that English was open architecture, diplomacy, science, business, and by doing that, he turned Singapore into this incredible commercial economy. Yeah. But then he's asked here what he thinks about China. He thinks China is a tremendous problem because of the Chinese language, and they've got 4,000 characters that forces them to think in a certain way. And in terms of the demographic problem, you really don't immigrate into China. I mean, it's not an open society in any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, so they've got another pressure here, which is he doesn't have even the ability to bring people in to help make things happen. Does that make sense?
Look, I think that it's important for any conversation like this to be balanced by the vulnerabilities of China as well as its strengths.
That's what I'm probing.
I think some of these may well be significant. The trouble is, enough momentum has been imparted to the kind of agenda that we've been warning about here, that even with those problems, even with us perhaps exploiting them modestly a bit ourselves, the trajectory is likely to be in the wrong direction for quite some time to come. And in that space of time, Bill, and again, I bring you back to where we started, if the Chinese are able to export this social credit score scheme around the world and enable thereby a degree of forced submission of populations worldwide, company store perhaps being a good analogy, perhaps just, colonial imperialism, whatever you want to call it, you could have, we talked about it earlier, a bad patch for the world, for the human race.
How would they export social credit? How would they export facial recognition? How would that
They're
manifest?
offering it right now.
Right now.
Okay.
Right now to Venezuela. They're offering it right now involved with the Belton Road, wherever they install things in the Belton Road, and they're going to be offering it in 5G.
That's right.
With Huawei. It will be putting in the development capabilities for them to monitor the entire world. If Huawei's 5G is adopted, and we've been fighting against that, but if it's adopted, they'll have access to all of the communications of the entire world.
Yeah. A friend of mine calls it 5G after the president.
XI.
Right. But here, just to give you an example, Bill, how does this work? The Chinese gave the African Union a headquarters, gave it to them, built it for them for free. Turns out, of course, the thing was completely wired for sound. And every night there would be a download to China of everything that was said in that building, enabling them to exercise a degree of control and influence.
I'm going to ask a question I know the answer to, but I want you two to answer it. Quickly describe how pervasive the Belton Road initiative is and what they're doing with their debt trap business and how they're spreading out throughout the world to these countries, making deals with a lot of dictators who want a new palace.
I think you're right when you say it throughout the world. Initially, you think of the Belton Road as just around China and just connecting their neighbors. But it is now Belton Road in Latin America. There's the Arctic version of the Belton Road. It's throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, yes. And so they've been offering money that they've been able to create offerings, financial offerings, debt offerings, mostly because of their large intellectual property theft that might be $200 to $600 billion a year is what they've been stealing.
Just from us.
From us, yes. And they've been able to turn around and offer new and greatest technology, and in exchange for you have access to our markets, which of course was false. They've never really given American companies true access to the Chinese market.
I was in the movie business briefly. Tried to get a U.S. movie released in China. It's not happening.
Well, you know what? They are bought out of Hollywood.
Yeah. Unless you make it a Chinese movie. In fact, there's an interesting little story going around at the moment, as you may know. Tom Cruise, I guess, has done a remake of Top Gun.
Mm-hmm.
And the flight jacket that he wears previously in the first movie had prominently featured the flag of Taiwan.
And Japan.
And Japan.
Yeah.
Both are gone.
Yeah.
In the make for China.
And Richard Gere, phenomenal actor.
Reverse
well-known.
product placement.
There you go.
Richard Gere, phenomenal actor, friend of the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
Richard Gere doesn't get any parts anymore because the Dalai Lama is not acceptable.
Yeah.
So they have a massive influence in our universities through the Confucius Institutes, a massive influence in Hollywood. You can't make a movie now unless you have Chinese approval.
But this goes to the point about culture as one of the realms of warfare. It's not just the economic, it's not just the national security.
It brings me to something. I was involved in the Trump transition helping figure out what we want to do at Treasury. And CFIUS, which is part of, I guess it's the
Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States.
And that had been exclusively focused on economic impact on investments. And now, as I understand it, that's turning more to cultural impact, or am I just being hopeful?
I doubt it. I think it's mostly now the case.
Because you're talking about, they are pervasively buying properties in Hollywood.
But the challenge has been,
Yeah.
going back to something we talked about earlier, Bill, the challenge has been that committee, whose ostensible purpose is to make sure that there are no national security downsides to foreign investment inside the United States, is chaired by the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department never saw a foreign investment that it didn't like.
Yeah.
So while there are other agencies that are involved in it, notably the Defense Department, it by and large is the case. The chairman
and Steve Mnuchin
drives
is
the
terrible
train.
on these issues.
Terrible.
It's like having investment banking and research housed in the same location. It's bad for investors, right? If you have investment banking and research because you want to get the deal flow from the company, and your research department ends up writing, "Oh yeah, it's a tremendous investment. You ought to invest there." So it's housed in one Treasury Department.
But wasn't the dot-com bubble great, though?
Yeah, exactly. Hey, that's what it gave us. Exactly.
And it was that research.
Pets.com right there.
It was that research that
China.com is the way you might think about it.
Yeah, you're watching the Bill Walton Show. We are in overtime with Frank Gaffney and Kevin Freeman. I'm tempted to go into double overtime, but I think probably exhaust us. So I'd like to get to your last thoughts, Frank and Kevin, about what our viewers ought to be thinking about how to deal with China.
Well, I think, first off, viewers need to weaponize their money. They need to realize that whatever their investments are, whether it's in a pension plan or whether it is an individual investment, those investments should not be funding the demise of their culture and their country. And so they need to get educated. That's why I started my show, Economic War Room, was to train
Which is
people.
a terrific show. It's on Blaze TV.
Yeah. And you can see economicwarroom.com.
Yeah.
We train people about the risks of having their money invested against their interests. And so I think that's the first and really most important thing that I can bring as a contribution, is to help people weaponize their money.
Mm-hmm. Great. Frank?
I have a little show myself. We have a syndicated radio program called Secure Freedom Radio. Kevin is one of our featured regulars, as a matter of fact.
Where do we find Secure Freedom?
Secure Freedom Radio is a podcast, of course, but it's also terrestrially broadcast on the American Family Network.
Okay.
FN. But I guess what I would suggest is that learn about these sorts of things through the kinds of resources that we're all providing, of course.
Right.
But also recognize that this may be our last chance, honestly, to get this right. And I give Donald Trump great credit for having the vision and the courage to say, we're not just going to continue doing business as usual on terms that are clearly unacceptable and unsatisfactory. And he's done that not just in the context of trade. He's developed a national security strategy that very explicitly identifies China as a foreign adversary of the United States. He has taken on Huawei as an example, though there's some backing and forthing on what exactly that's going to entail at the moment. But I think by and large, his attitude has been, call it America first, call it national security mindedness, call it whatever you wish. But we as a people will have a choice in this election cycle. And none of us is into the politics of this, I suppose, but I just want to say,
But elections matter.
elections are going to matter, and perhaps never more so than will we continue a robust policy of defending America's vital interests against China, which I don't expect we're going to see from the opposition to Donald Trump, whoever that may be.
Well, Biden has told us China's not a problem.
He told us that, and then he told us it might be. But the point is, his son took an immense amount of money from the Chinese, and that compromises him, I think, beyond repair. But the point is, when you ask what can we do, one of the things we can do is to make sure that our elected representatives understand the gravity of this problem based on the fact that we've gone to school on it ourselves, and that there are practical, necessary things that we can do in the economic space, in space itself, and in other national security arenas, and in the culture to ensure that it comes out right.
Kevin Freeman, Frank Gaffney, thank you. Tremendously interesting and I must say alarming show, but I think we've got some lines of action that you all provided, and let's come back in a few months and figure out where we take it from there. All right. So thanks for joining me on the Bill Walton Show overtime, and glad you joined us. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.